Dottie Rambo finally talks about Vestal Goodman at the age of 74. They were Southern Gospel's twin matriarchs. The talented composer with a haunting voice is Dottie Rambo. Vestal Goodman, the queen of gospel, a fearless and adored force. They created a legacy of soul-stirring revivals, harmonies, and hallelujah together. But there was tension, treachery, and stillness behind the gilded TV appearances and anointed duets. Fans saw only what they were supposed to perceive, until Dottie eventually mentioned Vestal, the word she had shunned for years, at the age of 74. What caused their sisterhood to disintegrate? What had Dottie been concealing all along? And what actually took place behind the lights of the pulpit? Let's investigate. There were dirt floors, worn Bibles, and women who had to shout louder just to be heard long before there were rhinestones, other specialties, and the tears that rolled with every high note. Vestal Goodman had previously been a force by the time her voice was heard by Dottie Rambo. A voice tearing through sin and grief like a velvet-wrapped freight train. A teenage songwriting prodigy from Kentucky at the time, was enthralled. In the 1950s, when gospel was still raw and revival tents were still popular, they met backstage. Vestal was already becoming known as the first lady of the gospel thanks to her booming contralto and long hair. In the meantime, Dottie was subtly establishing himself as the genre's mainstay by penning the tunes that others would becoming well known. Their origins were comparable. Pentecost, poverty, and a profound spiritual pain they were able to express only by music. They bonded instantly and without words. A recognition by both parties. Two women who had fought their way into a male-dominated and expectations-driven field. Dottie used to slip Vestal melodies written on napkins and hotel receipts in those early days. Vestal would sing them as though they were her own compositions. No credit was requested. There was none. It was gospel. It was the work of God. However, something smoldered beneath the surface even throughout those early years. In the spotlight, Vestal's renown grew louder, shinier, and more widely broadcast. Dottie stayed in the song's shadows. Dottie always smiled from the wings when the audience erupted in cheers for Vestal's performance of He Looked Beyond My Fault, but she never heard the acclaim. The dynamic between them changed as the 1960s arrived and the Southern gospel culture became more sophisticated or politicized. Vestal started introducing songs with phrases like, "I love," and made no reference to the girl who composed them in a restroom stall in a trailer park. As she grew more uneasy with the industry's commercial orientation, she started to question if she had been taken advantage of or had just been foolish. By the late 1960s, gospel had expanded beyond rural churches and revival tents. It involved high-stakes singing, record deals, and national tours. Gatherings where anointing was less important than alliances. And the rumors about Vestal and Dottie had begun in the hallowed backstage areas of those southern tabernacles. Vestal reportedly became envious of Dottie's prodigious songwriting. Some said Dottie was resentful of never being the center of attention. However, the most perilous rumors, the ones that were never mentioned in church newsletters or radio interviews, alluded to something more profound. A spiritual connection that dissolved boundaries and involved emotional entanglements. Vestal, according to Dottie, is my sister, my haven, and my storm. In a community where appearances were crucial and sin was always someone else's tale, it was the kind of phrase that made people take notice. Harmony, both musical and moral, was essential to the gospel movement in the South. Any deviation was risky. An anonymous source told a tabloid during a notorious convention in 1972 that two of the most prominent women in the genre had a falling out over personal matters. Although the piece was swiftly forgotten, the harm had already been done. That night, Dottie and Vestal did not share a stage for the first time, and neither of them gave an explanation. Vestal sought solace in the Happy Goodmans, her family band. Dottie focused on writing songs and going on solo tours, frequently singing acoustic renditions of the same hymns that Vestal had popularized. Eyes turned away as they walked past one another in green rooms, their silence growing louder than any sermon. By the time the 1980s rolled around, they had reservations on completely different circuits that were meticulously planned to prevent overlap. When fans noticed, they discreetly inquired as to what had transpired. Offstage, God had turned into a wedge rather than a bridge, but to the audience, they were still saints in succession. With each year that went by, the gap between Dottie and Vestal grew wider due to contrasting moral, gender, and ministry beliefs. Vestal embraced media and went on megachurch tours, leaning more into the prosperity gospel wave. Appearances, and wearing outfits that were more ornate than those of televangelists. Her performances evolved into a ministry of spectacle, becoming more dramatic and performative. Conversely, Dottie shrank back from the showmanship. She valued brokenness and rawness. She acknowledged in her latter years that she had wondered if the gospel had shifted from being primarily about grace to being overly focused on glory. The very community she helped create made her feel alone and even betrayed. Vestal Goodman, a soaring representation of that transformation, was at the heart of her disappointment. Dottie described Vestal as a woman of immense power and profound dread in private letters to close friends that were not made public until after her passing. She charged her with changing their past, wiping out their previous closeness in favor of a more wholesome account. A single, terrifying sentence concludes one letter. She buried the truth in rhinestones because she knew it. Nevertheless, neither ever openly challenged the other. It was a hymnal Cold War and interviews, of two glowing remarks and subtle omissions. They thanked each other on stage. They drove separate cars off stage. However, the weight of the absence was increasing, and Dottie was starting to write again after being plagued by silence. For herself, not for the crowd, nor for the church. For the record, it started with a microphone that was left on for too long. During the 1987 National Quartet Convention, a hot mic moment recorded a discussion not intended to be heard by the public. She turned her back on me when I needed her the most. Dottie Rambo said to a fellow performer in frustration. The phrase went viral in whispers. It was easy to figure out who she was. And there was division inside the Southern gospel circuit once more. It was between Vestal supporters and others who felt Dottie had been silenced for too long, not along denominational lines. Dottie was subtly removed from a number of significant gospel happenings. Insiders hinted at pressure from the Goodman camp behind the scenes, despite the promoters' claims of health issues. Vestal received a prominent invitation from the Gaither Homecoming Tour, which at the time was one of the largest venues for gospel veterans. Dottie was noticeably missing. Dottie's publicist dodged questions, but she became more reserved and quiet. A woman whose words had previously created religious empires now found it difficult to talk. There was no response from the Gospel Music Association. The tabloids avoided it. Southern gospel wasn't popular enough to be covered by scandal. It was a silent struggle, however, within the Bible Belt's radio stations and sanctuaries. Speaking anonymously, a seasoned producer referred to it as a theological divorce. He asserted that Vestal stood for tradition, success, and wealth. Dottie represented hardship, uncertainty, and spiritual transgression. There was only space for one type of woman in an illusion-based industry, and the other had to be forgotten. In 1994, there was a glimmer of hope. Sensing that Dottie was missing from his wildly popular Homecoming series, Bill Gaither got in touch. She was told, "It's time," by him. "The people need your voice." Dottie reluctantly and apprehensively consented to make an appearance, and they shared the stage once more for a single evening. Vestal wears a shimmering gold gown, Dottie in a subdued shade of blue. They were seen looking at each other on video. Nor grins, nor animosity, only the uncomfortable familiarity of a once holy, now broken link. They never sung together. Dottie departed early that evening while the other artists enjoyed standing ovations. Her aides subsequently disclosed that she sobbed in the van due to something considerably more heartbreaking, the knowledge that the applause had not been given to her. She was no longer recognized by the person she formerly thought of as her spiritual twin. Now there was total quiet between them. Not irate or resentful, just definitive. Vestal would periodically bring up Dottie's name in interviews throughout the course of the following 10 years, but always in the past tense and with courteous deference. Vestal, however, was hardly ever mentioned by Dottie. However, her voice would become softer when she did. She would divert her gaze as though recalling something too painful or holy to say aloud. The world of gospel went on. Old legends faded, new stars emerged, and Dottie resumed writing somewhere in the middle of Tennessee. Reflections, memoirs, and tidbits of a truth she had never fully revealed, not music for other people. The Southern gospel fan base had always been fiercely devoted, until one evening, decades later, she took a microphone at a women's conference and declared, no one expected. Unofficial fan clubs were founded by churches. Campaigns to write letters attempted to bring retired singers back to life. Additionally, message boards became into battlefields when the internet eventually arrived in the late 1990s. Supporters wanted to know why the two gospel queens never got back together. There were a lot of conspiracy theories. Moral failing was suggested by some. Others pointed the finger upon ministerial politics or envious husbands. Some even asserted that the women had previously been involved in romantic relationships. A notion that hung in the dark like incense smoke after a while but was never confirmed. Rebirth. The letter, or rather, the leak, came next. A scanned copy of a handwritten note purportedly written by Vestal in the late 1970s was uploaded online by a collector in 2002. The fan forums erupted when she wrote to a close confidant, "Daddy is hurting, but she's made choices I can't stand behind. God will judge, but I must protect my ministry." Which decisions were those? Furthermore, why would someone who professed to love her sister in? Did Christ opt to keep a public distance rather than make amends privately? Dottie was admitted to the hospital in the same year after suffering back injuries in a tour bus accident. She received hundreds of fan notes during her recuperation. Some were unique, but many were standard prayers, praise, and poetry. Dottie retained that letter, which said, "You don't have to die with her name on your tongue. Say it. Tell us. We'll still believe you." For years, she carried it in her Bible. And gradually, a change started to occur within her. She was worn out. She was getting older. At last, she was prepared to talk. It was a tiny church in a Georgian countryside. Just a local women's conference with a few hundred people and an open mic Q&A session, no cameras, no press. When a woman came up and posed a question that no one had dared to address in public, Dottie, aged 83, had just finished a simplified version of Sheltered in the Arms of God. "Have you and Vestal ever reconciled?" There was a long silence. Dottie glanced down and then gave a melancholy smile. "No," she replied. She then told them in pieces and broken sentences, "But I made peace with the truth." Dottie talked about years of quiet, interrupted calls and discussions, music Vestal claimed as her own, and shared hotel rooms that were transformed into battlefields. However, above all, she mentioned treachery. It was developed out of fear, not malice. Dottie claimed that she recognized me before anyone else did. She was frightened by that. There was silence in the room. Participants would later characterize it as more of a lifting, a release, than a confession. Vestal's legacy was not to be destroyed by Dottie. She didn't harbor resentment. All she wanted was to stop dying in fragments. She only talked about the hurt of being left out of someone else's gospel. She didn't go into specifics, obscene details, or scandals. She asserted that forgiveness and forgetting are two different things. And all the myths around their sisterhood fell apart at that instant. A final altercation occurred in 1981 while on a summer tour in Alabama. Dottie had received an invitation to play with the Happy Goodmans at a charity event for their reunion. It was created as a moment of healing and a celebration of heritage. But emotions were strong behind closed doors. Vestal was late. Dottie was already reading a devotional while sat in the dressing room. For a few minutes, neither woman said anything. When Dottie finally looked up, he remarked, "We should pray." Vestal allegedly responded, "Not everything can be fixed with a prayer." What transpired next was a chilly, quiet discourse that only occurs between two people who used to know each other's hearts too well. Dottie questioned why no one ever returned the calls. Why she felt erased and why credits vanished. Vestal was silent for a while. Then, they were never able to handle you. Simply put, I didn't want to accompany you down. After folding her Bible, Dottie got up and walked away. That night, she didn't perform. The promoters hurried to provide an explanation for her absence. Sonjing, Vestal said, I wouldn't take. Now, nothing for my journey, she said, her eyes welling with tears. The crowd was unaware of what had transpired just hours earlier. They would not see one another again. With a suitcase in one hand and a Bible in the other, he walked along the backstage hallway by himself. On that particular night, Dottie Rambo left the platform and the woman who had previously held her hand during resurrection fires. Following Vestal Goodman's death in December 2003, the gospel community entered grieving. The tributes came pouring in. She was recalled as the Queen of Gospel in national headlines. Her best performances were rerun by the networks. Condolences were sent by pastors and presidents. A letter was sent by Dottie Rambo. The brief, handwritten document, which was 1 page long, was given to the funeral director with the request that it be read aloud during the service. Those present observed that it was never read aloud, but the contents were never made public. Rather, it stayed enclosed in a relative's coat pocket. No one could say whether it was intentionally hidden or forgotten. Di didn't bring up the letter again. When questioned if she was there at the funeral and subsequent interviews, she merely responded, I was there in spirit. However, there are some areas where you can be present without being seen. According to insiders, the letter was an apology. Some claim it served as a warning. According to some, Dottie even admitted to preserving Vestal's legacy at her own expense. One thing was certain, regardless of what it stated. It was Dottie's last act, an attempt to end a chapter that had plagued her for decades, but it was never intended for public consumption. It was also silenced, like so much of their story. Dottie Rambo, who was weak and quiet at the age of 74, stopped touring but continued to write in notebooks, on scrap paper, and in the margins of books. She started recording voice memos in her final years. Stories, memories, names, not music. That memo was never intended for public publication, but in one of the last recordings, her slender but unflinching voice states, we were never enemies, but she chose the stage, and I chose the truth. I hope she knows now that I never stopped loving her. However, her daughter included snippets in a tribute film following Dottie passing in 2008. Her voice was heard one final time by fans. Unguarded, unfiltered. Additionally, they heard nothing for the first time. An icon of the gospel. A human, pained woman spoke to them. Instead of a feud, the competition that molded two empires ended in silence, followed by a whisper. The whole truth might never be revealed to us. But maybe that's the idea. Not all truths are designed to be broadcast in unison or yelled from a pulpit. Some are designed to be silently carried until the burden becomes too much. And Di finally laid hers down after 83 years. One stillness, two legends, and a truth that has been developing for decades. Every song has untold tales, rebuilt relationships, and sanctified suffering behind it. Vestal Goodman and Dottie Rambo provided us with soul-saving music. However, the cost was quiet, which almost broke them. What additional realities about the gospel are still hidden? For more, subscribe.